Welcome to Around the Empire, the show that takes you around the U.S. Empire. I'm your host, Dan Wright.
I'm your co-host, Joanne.
And on today's show, April 14th, 2017, we speak with Brad Hoff, an educator, investigative journalist, and Marine veteran who has traveled and lived in the Middle East, including Syria. We discuss the recent chemical weapons attacks in Khan Shaykhun and the 2013 attack in Ghouta, Syria, and the parallels between the two. We also examine the White House assessment and counterarguments from experts about the evidence. Here is that interview.
Hi, Brad. Thanks so much for doing this interview with us today.
Hey, Brad.
Thanks for having me on, Joanne and Dan. So great to be here.
So today we're going to talk about the chemical weapons attacks, the recent one in Syria in 2017, and also we're going to talk a little bit about the 2013 attack too and the parallels there. All the reporting that I've seen in U.S. media on the April 4th chemical weapons attack in Khan Shaykhun attribute the attack to Syrian President Assad and some level of certainty. And we know we have a White House assessment that is certain also. And all the authorities in the United States who've spoken about it were certain that they're sure that Assad did it. There are some parallels to the 2013 Ghouta attack. And Brad has a lot of contacts in the region with some journalists and others. He's studied some of the evidence and the documents from both the 2013 and the current attack. So we'd like to talk to you about that and also your recent trip to Syria. And one of the counterarguments that I have seen, I've seen several of them, but we have Jerry Smith, former chemical weapons inspector in Syria, and he was involved in the 2013 investigations. You know, he's basically just urging, let's do an investigation here. And we also have MIT professor Theodore Postal, who also did an assessment after the 2013 attack. And he has some pretty severe doubts about the White House assessment. He issued his own 14-page, just a quick turnaround assessment of the White House intelligence report is the way he describes it. So I just want to play a couple clips. First, we have, as I said, Jerry Smith.
Is there any way that Assad might not have been responsible for this?
The fact of the matter is that there is. I mean, clearly the US may well have some significant amounts more information than I do, and therefore they've made a judgment on that. But I think one of the things that we should do, certainly early on last week, was that we need to listen to every story and then start to pick it apart. Some of the stories that come out are not true. And the stakeholders that are saying them are having a line because they want to, their own narrative. If we start to pick this apart effectively, their stories will fall away. But I think if we judge very, very quickly, the danger is that we miss things and therefore we get things wrong.
So that was Smith. And then we also have, I took just some summary level information from Postal. We can talk about some of the details, more details of his report, but just to give you a sense overall of how he thinks about this.
I think this is an indication that there is something extremely problematic in the American national system with regard to the use of intelligence. This particular report is in some ways exactly parallel to the report that occurred in the Obama administration. Factual claims that could not be true. What I think a rational approach would be for there to be two investigations. There should be an international investigation, probably under the UN, since both the Russian and American sides have at some level vested interests, but some organization like the UN, where of course the Russian and Americans can provide their input and their arguments. And then there needs to be a second investigation. This would be an American investigation. And we need an investigation into how such a false intelligence report could be generated at the highest levels of our government. This is very serious. This confrontation with Russia has some potential to escalate, and if it's escalating over false intelligence claims, that is very serious. And in addition, I would argue that such an investigation of this report should also include a complete investigation of what happened when Obama was initially misled into thinking that there was an attack by the Assad government. We know that Obama was told after he initially believed it was the Assad government, he was told that it was not necessarily the case. So he was initially given incorrect intelligence, and then it was corrected, although the public was never told about this.
Okay, so Brad, if you could sort of share with our listeners some of what you've collected and learned so far in your investigative reporting, that would be great.
Sure, thanks. I actually want to start with a quote from Nassim Nicholas Taleb. He's a world-famous mathematician, statistician. He studies probability. He said, when Americans see horrible suffering, as well as, in some cases, many cases, dead children on their screen, the need for evidence goes out the window. And the fact is, we saw hours after the events at Khan Shaykhun, we saw within hours headlines around the world, many of them issued from Western reporters in Beirut, speak with a kind of mathematical certainty. And it's a very simple narrative. Assad, the evil dictator, gassed his own people. There was no scientific evidence. There's still, right now as we speak, 10 days later, no independent international body on the ground evidence. And so that clip you played of Jerry Smith, for example, is very important. This is an absolute world authority, and he went on both British Channel 4 News and Sky News, these are major British TV networks, to say the science is not in. And that clip you played was from last Sunday. So again, we see another Iraq WMD echo chamber situation once again. And so again, to say a little bit more about who Jerry Smith is, because this is such an important clip that people need to go watch the full interview. It's about 6 minutes. He was the deputy head of the 2013 to 2014 UN mission to decommission Syria's sarin, a deal broker between the United States, Russia, and Syria, going on British TV, publicly saying, possible that this might not have been Assad. It could be. One can only perhaps speak in likelihoods based on circumstantial evidence and based on, well, all we have is YouTube videos uploaded to social media and a couple of autopsies that's been done by the Turkish Health Ministry, supposedly in the presence of World Health Organization officials. He mentioned and talks about all of that in his statements, but at the same time, he's cautioning the world to not jump the gun here and play judge, jury, and executioner before the science is in. And frankly, he's not the only one that has weighed in on this. We have Hans Blix, a famous Iraq UN inspector. We have Scott Ritter as well, one of the lone military and UN inspectors that went to war with the Bush administration over the 2003 Iraq WMD claims. And of course, we can talk about Scott Ritter's Huffington Post article maybe a little later in the interview. He's got a bit of a checkered past, but you have these various world experts who have experience, decades of experience in both chemical weapons and in battlefield collection techniques and so on, saying, hold on, we do not actually ultimately know exactly who did it, even the delivery method. We just don't know so much. And the fact is, in terms of my contacts that I've been keeping up with, in terms of important journalists, especially out of Beirut, I got to know a number of them during my November trip to Damascus. You know, in terms of private conversations with them, they're actually incredibly frank at how speculative some of the current data is. But when you actually read their headlines and their articles, and of course, I suppose editors get a hold of them as well, they speak in a kind of certainty that they admit in personal conversation doesn't exist. So that's what I tend to tell people in terms of people I encounter just in daily life and work life and so on. Look, the world authorities on these issues are actually urging caution, including, right, that clip you played, Dr. Theodore Postol. This is an MIT rocket scientist who is considered probably the foremost authority in the United States and in the military-industrial field. Right.
Yeah, I cite him because he's the one who we have a substantial response from. And just one of the things that he says is there's a video, there are some photos, and there's a video of a crater in a road, and some guys collecting asphalt or soil samples from it. And he says that, first of all, he has a problem with the claim that our infrared satellite surveillance could detect both the launch and impact of the rocket, because a chemical weapons rocket doesn't have an explosion. It has, the actual warhead has liquid chemicals in it. And the other thing that he said is that from what he saw, that munition wasn't dropped from an aircraft. He believes that it was placed there. I thought those were the two most compelling things that he had to say about it. Are the other experts, are they giving any specific details that cause them to have serious doubts? Or are they, just giving, in my opinion, good advice of, let's do an investigation before we have a war here?
Stahl's report is admittedly hasty and rudimentary, and he actually says that in his introductory narrative. And so my hope is that, and other scientists are hard at work on a more systematic, lengthier report examining all the data that's accessible or that we have. But before we really get more into his report, it's important that we go back to the Ghouta incident in August 2013. Of course, as you noted in your intro, a very parallel situation where, again, there was a rush to judgment. And we saw evidence come out later, for example, in the Goldberg interview with Obama in the Atlantic, where, there's a story of Obama's Director of National Security, James Clapper, interrupting a CIA briefing to say, "Sir, this is not a slam dunk concerning Assad's use of chemical weapons in Ghouta." And of course, that echoed the famous slam dunk to 2003 Iraq WMD and so on. In those weeks after the August 21st, 2013 Ghouta incident, the world awaited hard scientific evidence, just like we're awaiting hard scientific evidence right now. Well, that evidence finally came of 2013 in the form of an 82-page United Nations report. This was the final report produced after of on-the-ground interviews, soil samples taken to scientific labs, autopsies, and so on. But by December 2013, when the 82-page report came out, it seems the world had moved on. Because what did that report find? I would encourage the listeners to go and read that 82-page report. You can find it on the United Nations website. In the introductory material, the UN explicitly states that they found evidence of chemical usage between the parties in Syria. That was a pretty surprising admission, because up till then, dominant accepted narrative within the political class as well as mainstream media was that it could have only been Assad. Only Assad has chemical weapons, and so on. But the United Nations was very explicit in its opening paragraphs of the 82-page report. They found evidence of usage between the parties. It studied 5 cases. In these cases, spring of 2013 into August, September of 2013. Out of the 5 cases, it found that it was Syrian soldiers of chemical weapons attacks. In the other 2 cases, it was civilians that were affected. And the UN was also explicit in saying that 2 of those attacks where Syrian soldiers were victims actually came after the August 21st. And so that's the United Nations official report, which the world had awaited and debated and so on, actually certain terms saying the rebels possess and have used chemical weapons. And that's actually why a guy like Jerry Smith, whose clip you played at the start of the interview, that is why, who put these various studies together, who oversaw the decommissioning of Syria's sarin stockpile, that is why he is urging extreme caution. If you actually pour through the OPCW documents as well as the UN documents, you'll see that these case studies are littered with both accusations and evidence, weapons usage coming from both sides. So the fact is, we're talking still 10 days out, no investigators on the ground, much less jumping to conclusions 48 hours later like the world did. And with this attack, we need to be extra cautious, especially when there's a rush to war. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, especially when war and escalation is on the line.
Right. So we have to also remember that the narrative is already prefabbed. I mean, as we recently see in real time, they already had Assad blamed. They already had now. Let me be very clear. I don't know what actually happened. I'm not an expert in this area at all. But what I do know is media strategy. And the reality is there was a media strategy already prepared the minute for something like this to happen. Now, that was a reasonable expectation if you believe the 2013 attack, I guess. But the media, as soon as this attack was reported from sketchy sources, let's be clear, this is not a lot of great reporters on the ground. You got the white helmets who are clearly a biased actor who work with the jihadist groups. When this came out, there was this extreme rollout. All the mainstream media, particularly in the West, grabbed onto this narrative. Assad just gassed his own people and then shoved it down everyone's throat. Everyone got on the same beat. It was a nice little media harmony, and they all sang it at the same time. Now, how would have any of them independently verified that? They didn't. So I guess that's kind of more interesting to me at the moment. Well, both of those points are important, which is there seems to be a built-in system that gets activated, and no matter how many times these people screw up, whether it be in Iraq or elsewhere, it still exists. All you have to do is flip the switch. And I don't really know how people who are going to wait for the evidence can compete with people who have no interest in waiting for the evidence or may have already gotten the script beforehand.
To me, it looked like almost a replay of August, the end of August, beginning of September of 2013. A weekend of B-roll, terrible video images over and over and over again. And Secretary of State John Kerry already had sort of a presentation, and he and Martin Dempsey and the Secretary of Defense at the time, whose name just is escaping me, but
it's the same old cry routine.
They went around.
It's the same old routine.
Yeah, they already had their presentation to Congress, various committee hearings in Congress. They had that ready to roll. I felt like the same kind of thing was happening again here in April with this latest attack.
Well, and I try to tell people, just average people who don't know a lot about Syria beyond what they see on their TV, I try to tell them, look, do not assume that the reporter you see on TV or the journalist behind the article you're reading, do not always assume that they have special knowledge, that they're even on the ground. Do not assume that they've even visited Syria. You would be shocked at how many world-renowned journalists and analysts. Do not assume that they have some kind of special insider expertise or knowledge that you don't. We tend to assume that. Frankly, in the last week, as I've been in contact with some of these very journalists who, by the way, are driving world headlines, especially some of the journalists that hang out in Beirut, and they are the high-placed editors and these major newsrooms and so on. I've literally talked to some of these people. It's shocking when you hear these very people say, oh, yeah, it's true. Tahrir al-Sham, who controls Idlib, is not letting anyone in, is not letting investigators in. They're not letting OPCW in yet. I've had direct confirmation of this from some of these world-renowned reporters who turn around and then write articles that say, oh, yeah, it's a slam dunk case. Of course Assad did it. But they tend to be more frank in personal conversation in terms of admitting some level of speculation. And, I was literally told by one very visible journalist, some of whose very articles led the charge. We're talking less than 48 hours, April 4th, the day of the attack. This person essentially admitted there's no science, but basically told me, okay, come on, we all know it's Assad. Of course it is. Who else? Come on. And so people need to realize when you start really digging into the sources, it's pretty thin. It's all pretty thin until we get people on the ground. I did just receive word last night that it looks like an OPCW, and I'm sorry, I shouldn't keep speaking in acronyms, but this is Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, they typically work in tandem with United Nations investigators. I just got word that they are just now getting their formation in place. Now, no one really knows what that's going to look like because it's still up in the air as to whether or not they'll even get in. And of course, there was a bit of a showdown at the United Nations the other day when Russia vetoed a resolution for an on-the-ground investigation in Syria. I suppose this is largely because Russia sees the language as already basically finding Assad guilty. There's also issues like the resolution, I believe, demanded access to basically all of Syria's military bases, and it's concerning that that's a kind of, in the midst of a horrible, grinding civil war, a great risk in terms of exposing Syria's defenses and so on. I don't know all of Russia's rationales for vetoing that resolution, but people need to understand the science is still out on this. There is really nothing empirical that we have other than a host of horrible social media videos that were uploaded to YouTube that are coming from territory that's under the control of Tahrir al-Sham, which is dominated by al-Nusra Front as well as Ahrar al-Sham, literally al-Qaeda, the same people that attacked the United States on 9/11. And so it's actually shocking even the extent to which the White House dossier, which, by the way, is not a national intelligence estimate. It was probably put together by staffers both in the White House and the National Security Council. It has not been backed, to my knowledge, from the 16 intelligence agencies, much less the CIA. It really takes a high threshold for the heads of these intelligence organizations to attach their name to it. And typically a formal national intelligence estimate takes weeks, if not a couple of months to prepare and sign off on. But surprisingly, this White House dossier that came out, it's actually easy to read. It's only 3.5 pages. It relies very heavily on what it calls open source intelligence, essentially
right
to YouTube.
I also noticed that, maybe I shouldn't bring this up, over at Pat Lang's site, one of the writers at that site has, I don't know how many decades of experience and really trashed this White House assessment. I won't even say the words he used.
But to the point then, don't we know that, particularly with Trump's case, and everybody's a face planted in Syria. Obama totally blew out maneuver. And by the way, it totally worked. He got incredible press for the first time of his presidency because we have a media system and an elite within DC who simply, there's no other way to say this. They have like wargasms. They love war. They can't get enough of it. It's very life affirming for them to see things get blown up. I don't know where that comes from. Brian Williams did a little soliloquy when he saw the Tomahawk missiles being launched. It was surreal to watch for normal people, but they love it. So, maybe Trump, it's very possible from my perspective that the Trump administration didn't particularly care if it was true. They wanted an opportunity to distinguish themselves. They even got the praise they wanted, which was to keep blaming Obama for it and say, look at the difference in President Obama's inaction. So I want to, maybe the White House doesn't care if it's true or not. What do you think of that?
I think that's the case. This was a political opportunity, a political moment. And a lot of other people have done this kind of analysis in terms of what's in it for Trump. And a lot of people actually are reading this, some respected analysts are reading this, at least domestically, as a brilliant political maneuver. But yeah, you even have anti-Trump fanatical Democrats now singing his praises over Syria. And yeah, there's something about this whole rush to judgment kind of echo chamber, as I said, completely lacking in actual scientific authority or data. Yes, there's something to it that once that sort of cycle begins, as we saw in 2003, for example, you just can't walk it back, right? And so it's this sort of circular kind of thing where once both the media and politicians and the White House itself is heavily invested in a narrative, it's an incredible feat to require of the mainstream media, which they're not going to do, to chip away at a narrative they've already wholeheartedly invested themselves in. But I want to go back, by the way, Joanne mentioned Colonel Pat Lang. You should absolutely bring up his analysis, yes, because people need to understand who Colonel Pat Lang is. You can find his analysis at his blog, Six Semper Tyrannis. And Colonel Pat Lang is a legendary Defense Intelligence Agency officer who was basically Middle East intelligence chief for the Department of Defense throughout most of the 1980s. And so he is an absolute authority, especially in understanding how intelligence is produced, what we're able to know, what we don't know, and then sort of weighing that with what the media is reporting at any given moment. Throughout this litany of various authorities, both in terms of chemical weapons, rocket science, and intelligence, I'll be the first to say that Assad is entirely capable of the worst kind of brutality and evil and chemical weapons, you name it, whatever it is. But at the same time, Assad is not stupid. He's not willing to make decisions that will lead to his own demise at a time when he's winning. He's not willing to risk this much to basically just punish a bunch of people and launch chemical weapons on a town which really has no strategic importance whatsoever. This is a dusty Damascus highway town in the south of Idlib province, and I have not been able to figure out the strategic significance other than you may have had some various al-Qaeda leaders hanging out there for sure. But an ISIS affiliate, even as recently as last fall, had a strong presence there as well. But the point of all this is, I'm not here saying, for I know who did this. What I'm going to do is point out the various world authorities in important areas who are saying, "Whoa, people, let's take a breath. Let's take a step back here, and let's do some scientific analysis. Let's do the very thing that wasn't done as we charged into Iraq." I mean, my goodness, you would think that some of the very same media figures who got Iraq wrong would be more cautious. But no, as I quoted Taleb earlier, that this expert in probability and this mathematician, as well as an astute Syria observer, right? He said, look, we're very emotional people, right? Once those emotions take hold, the need for scientific data goes out the window.
Yeah, the report, the blog post on Pat Lang's blog was actually not Lang himself, but it was TTG, one of his colleagues, also in the same field. I don't know specifically his identity and his CV, but he says that he has 10 plus years of experience with the subject matter, and he calls the White House report a steaming pile of manure, to be quite frank. He's also placing a lot of value on Phil Giraldi's report early on, and Phil is ex-CIA, and he has contact with military and intelligence sources on the ground in the region who immediately put out a warning saying, no, this isn't what happened. And then Phil is also part of an organization called VIPS, Veteran Intelligence Professionals. And I believe they also wrote a letter that was published by Consortium News. I actually didn't read the whole thing yet. But they're all warning that it doesn't appear to be the way the White House is saying it. So it's just another person to add to the pile. And I'm not seeing this coming through in U.S. media. I'm not seeing this counter-narrative, counter-arguments.
But they're actually going after people who offer counter-narratives. So, for example, Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard, who herself, I believe, is a veteran, just said to investigate. I'm not sure he did it. And she was pilloried. In fact, Neera Tanden of the Center for American Progress, Hillary Clinton's organization, Howard Dean, former chair of the Democratic National Committee, said she should be primaried and taken out of her seat in Congress for daring to question whether Assad was behind these chemical attacks. So it's not just that. I mean, I think the thinking about this is, well, it's not getting through. Why aren't the people understanding this? There's a concerted effort to not just promote a certain narrative, but to destroy people offering that critique within the media system right now. And the only saving grace that I have, or that I've seen that's made me at least somewhat hopeful, is how terrible the Trump White House is at communications. And that a standard, I mean, this goes back 50 years, is for America to claim its enemies are the new Hitler. This goes back forever. This is how we motivate people in this country, because World War II is the good war, quote unquote. And Sean Spicer got before the press, and in an effort to demonize Assad in the same way Saddam Hussein was demonized, in the same way Noriega, I think there's a whole list someone put up, came out there and said, even Hitler didn't use chemical weapons on his own people. God. And now that is a standard thing to say to the American people, who are, by and large, I agree, emotional and a little bit simple-minded, to be even more blunt. And so to call people Hitler is kind of a useful way to do it. And he couldn't even do that right. So the reason this well-oiled machine seems to be hitting the ground a few times, or rather stalling, is because the Trump White House is not as versed as the Obama White House in playing the right notes. So that's kind of my structure. I think there's absolutely great dissenting voices out there. They're being pilloried, including members of Congress. The only thing kind of shutting this down a little bit from being even more intense, and therefore giving pretext for Trump to do something even more stupid, is how bad the Trump White House is at communicating. And instead of talking about how terrible Assad was for the last few days, we've been talking about how Sean Spicer doesn't understand that there was, quote, Holocaust centers, concentration camps, I think is what he was saying.
Well, it's amazing that a press that, prides itself on, being liberal, combative to, in terms of fourth estate, government watchdog, and so on. It's amazing that they're basically taking the White House word for it, but the same White House who sends a spokesman out to essentially deny the Holocaust, when he had that statement about Hitler didn't even use gas, and then he tries to clarify or explain. That doesn't go well either. Yeah. He has this awkward phrase he invents. They were sent to the Holocaust centers, and then I don't know if you noticed, but he couldn't even say Assad's name right. I think he said something like Bassa al-Ashir. Yeah. Right. I mean, it was a comedy of errors, and yet everyone's going to take the White House word for it, and this very thin-looking dossier. And actually, I've briefly talked to some pretty well-known Syria analysts who themselves tend to be very sympathetic to the rebel side. As we know, many of these think tankers have basically launched their career in the midst of this horrible Syrian war, and they've become experts at sort of mapping and charting the different rebel groups that pop up from month to month. And some of these very analysts I've seen admit, even though they think Assad did it, they've admitted this White House dossier is it's very thin. It doesn't give us anything new. And I have the impression that it is actually just recirculating some of the early media reports, really dependent, again, as I said, of videos on social media and so on. So we really have nothing new. But yeah, at the end of the day, if you trust the White House's word on the events in Khan Shaykhun, you're essentially trusting a White House that more or less denied the Holocaust. I mean, whether it was a gaffe or not, I don't know what to make of it. Sean Spicer out of there for sure.
Yeah, but it's funny that you brought this up earlier, and this is why it's so interesting, is that Democrats who have said nothing but all Trump does is lie. He's a foreign agent, right? They have Russiagate conspiracies. They have all this litany of him making false or going back on campaign statements. In fact, his attack on Assad came the same week that his Secretary of State and his UN ambassador explicitly said we're okay with Assad staying. That we, they're the people to decide. We have this is not our goal. The same week is when he did those strikes, and then changed rhetoric too and said, well, no, he can't be part of the future of Syria. So these same Democrats, these hardline Democrats who have been saying all this about Trump, suddenly he shoots a few cruise missiles, and that can't be wrong. And so I think it's just interesting that there is really a war constituency that is bipartisan. And one of the polls I noticed that was really disturbing to me is that among Democrats, support for regime change was at 38% under Obama. It's at 37% now. So the Democratic Party has been, most Democrats, not the loud ones you see, or not the establishment figures like Neera Tanden and Howard Dean, for the most part, does not want to get involved in another major war in the Middle East. The Republicans, under Obama, their support was 35%, 36%. Now it's like 85% because it's their guy doing it. Now, that's a very dangerous thing to play with, that kind of quick switch. But then you have to ask yourself, who is going to restrain Trump from actually going all in here? What's going to stop him from doing this again? He clearly doesn't care about international law. He clearly doesn't even care about consulting Congress. And because it's a Republican Congress, apparently they don't care about being consulted anymore, amazingly, because when Obama did it, what people who need a little history of this is, in 2013, many of us were absolutely adamant against Obama going in after the quote-unquote first red line crossing. And we made phone calls, we talked to people, and the Republicans in Congress did it. Now, part of it was the hope that they were somewhat more libertarian leaning. Rand Paul was a leader on that. But what it clearly was now, I guess, was just partisanship. They just didn't like Obama. They thought it would help him. Although I thought maybe some of the residual damage of Libya was in their minds. But I would hope. And now it looks like they're completely okay with subverting congressional authority and launching another major war. So I don't really see what's your take on how this will play out if Trump does, for headlines, for whatever reason, or maybe because he believes this report and has this analysis, actually does go into Syria and actually does decide to take out Assad?
Well, if we look at the late 90s and Bill Clinton's bombings of Iraq, we know that this definitely opens the door to all-out war. And that's what's very dangerous about this. I don't think in the near term we're headed for a full engagement or invasion of Syria, even though, yes, of course, through hundreds of special forces, especially embedded in Kurdish areas, yes, we do have boots on the ground. We should be clear about that. But in terms of a full-on Iraq-style invasion, I don't actually think that's happening anytime soon. But the fact is, this type of very visible, overt escalation, these Tomahawks being sent to an airbase outside of Homs, this does set a precedent which opens the door. The door is now wide open for any kind of future ground war, whether it comes in 2 months, 2 years. This horrible war doesn't wrap up, in 5 years. It could be 5 years down the road. But if you look at the pattern of our engagement in Iraq through the 90s, it's a very familiar path to war, and it's scary. But speaking of that, a lot of my cynicism and skepticism over the recent or potential chemical attack in Syria, well, it comes from, number one, I was involved as a Marine during the first time there was a Ba'athist dictator and there was charges of WMD. I have personally lost friends. Two, since I got out of the military, I basically kind of depressed myself by reading tell-all books written by former intelligence officials, weapons inspectors, State Department employees, and so on, talking about the web of lies that was spun in the lead up to Iraq. I just got finished with the latest one. You may be familiar with John Nixon's book, Debriefing the President, the Interrogation of Saddam Hussein. So this is the former CIA senior analyst who is literally the first to extensively interview Saddam. And there's just a whole litany of authoritative voices exploring the very nuanced, subtle, in some cases, subtle, nuanced web of lies spun over Iraq. So call me a cynic when I see the same thing playing out again, and people are judge, jury, and executioner in a matter of hours. I'm just a cynic. I have to be. I have personally lost. I have personally had skin in the game. And you talk about these reporters who love to cheer this kind of thing, or even the politicians or even the think tankers. You see this pattern, and the pattern is they don't have anyone they know in these places affected. Most often they've never served in the military. They didn't lose friends who stepped on IEDs and were blown to bits in Iraq. They have not experienced this, and they have no, involvement or potential loss whatsoever. And so, it's clear to most people I talk to, even just average Americans, my neighbors who don't know much about Syria, even if they do think Assad is going around gassing his own people, even if they think that, to understand that a full-on invasion, occupation, regime change in Syria and so on would make Iraq look like Disneyland. It would be the ugliest, bloodiest, most horrible thing in modern history. The Syrian war has already been just that. Our involvement will only kill more people. And the fact is, our bombing raids over eastern Syria, as we speak, are offing a lot of civilians, many more than are even alleged to have been killed supposedly by Assad.
Well, it was that same week that, and this was something that a few people pointed out, myself on Twitter, and then resoundingly yelled at, was that same week or the week prior, the U.S. had bombed Mosul and killed an estimated 200 civilians. So, I mean, if we're going to talk about body counts, I mean, I don't know. If I was killed and I'm dead, I'm not sure I care that much that it was chlorine versus shrapnel ripping my head off. I mean, I'm still dead. So, I mean, you have to question also what – there is no strategy. I mean, that's the other part of this Trump press release bombing is he doesn't know what he would do if he – let's say he actually was able to punish Assad to the point of overthrowing the regime without sending in troops, which I actually think is not going to happen. What's he going to do if Assad goes down and then have al-Nusra and, I mean, maybe ISIS will reconstitute itself? Remember, ISIS is partly reconstituted Fedayeen Saddam. It's not like these people just go away. They stick around and they wait for their chance. And eventually one comes. So it's just going to be an endless war. The only part that's even scarier, if this could get any worse, is imagine if he stops warning the Russians ahead of time that he's going to strike like he did in this strike. Well, now you're killing Russians. I don't know how that ends. I mean, Turkey shot down a Russian jet, and quite frankly, I wasn't sure what was going to happen next. If people remember that incident, I believe that may have been Turkey at one point did shoot down a Russian jet. Turkey's a member of NATO. If Russia had retaliated, what happens next? I don't know.
I've seen some people playing down that angle too, of it leading to a world war or a broader war, and I think it's a really bad idea to play that down, because, well, why would you? First of all, but I mean, the whole region is a tinderbox. It's not just Russia. We're talking about Iran, too. We're talking about Hezbollah. We're talking about Israel. There's just so many different angles. Turkey's, in my view, not a very stable actor at the moment.
Turkey has too many goals. Maybe we should talk about Turkey just for a minute. Turkey helped ISIS. Let's keep it real. They armed ISIS. They gave them sanctuary. They let people flow into Syria through the Turkish border, what was called the Jihadi Highway. Now they're legitimately oppositional because they had this falling out, partly because Turkey was supporting other groups, partly because they were they changed and let Incirlik become a point. And so ISIS responded. They did a New Year's Eve bombing in Istanbul, and now they're at odds. But they were playing a double game for a long time, which is saying that they were on our side and that they opposed terrorism, while at the same time arming ISIS and al-Qaeda affiliates, one, to overthrow Assad, and two, to constrain Kurdish expansion, which they're scared of, right? So Turkey's not an honest actor. Is that fair?
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, they've supported the opposition. They say that they're part of the coalition, anti-ISIS coalition, but that's a joke. That's a complete joke. And it's politically advantageous for Erdogan to maintain some level of support for the quote-unquote rebel opposition.
Yeah, I actually want to share a quick anecdote, if I may. Again, speaking of important voices or authorities that are out there saying about Turkey that the mainstream media essentially ignores, there's a man named Sinan Chidi from Georgetown University. He is the head of Turkish studies at Georgetown's Foreign Service School, and he recently went on a kind of speaking tour of universities, especially throughout the South. So I got to hear him speak here at a university in Texas. It was University of Texas at Austin. And he consistently gave the same message throughout this tour. But I was very skeptical going into this talk. I hear, okay, head of Turkish studies at Georgetown University. Come on. He's going to probably sound very establishment and mainstream. I was absolutely shocked. This Foreign Service School head I mean, this is the school that trains our, career State Department personnel and diplomats and so on. He straight up said that Erdogan is using ISIS as his personal army. I mean, I was shocked. This guy sounded like what, most think tankers would label some kind of conspiracy theorists or alternative indie journalists. But I so regret not having videotaped. This is a world authority essentially saying Erdogan is using ISIS as his personal tool for Syria policy and, of course, against the Kurds and all those pesky minorities he's trying to get rid of along the Turkish border as well as in the east. But I was absolutely shocked. And the fact is, you can find many similar voices, especially there's a kind of unanimity when it comes to Turkey, and it's allowing its border to just be a jihadi highway. A lot of authoritative voices. There's a unanimity, but you wouldn't know that by watching mainstream media for sure.
Turkey also played a big role in the reporting on this latest chemical weapons attack, too, which not only did we get, I think the only evidence that we got is from Syrian opposition sources with an assist from Turkey. So,
right, a couple of autopsies overseen by the Turkish Ministry of Health. So a couple Turkish doctors, but the claim is that there was a World Health Organization presence. Now, I don't know. I haven't seen any scientific paperwork. We don't know any names. In fact, sadly, a lot of the journalists that could have covered this directly on the ground are in prison in Turkey.
Oh, that's right.
Right, and people should know that Turkey, while Turkey's relationship with ISIS and what you just said about a professor basically making it public, or at least admitting to it in public, is this thing a lot of people know about. Turkey is openly training the Free Syrian Army. This is actually a point of contention. It's openly training rebel forces who are jihadists, who are extremists, who are going into Syria. This is one of the reasons they've had these border skirmishes. And now the border is almost completely blurred, and they've actually gone in, and at least in February of last year, they were shelling the Kurds, much to our dismay, I think around northern Aleppo and
Afrin, yeah.
Yeah, so they're actively involved in this war. So their relationship with ISIS, I think, is very clear. But even if you don't buy that, right, there's not enough evidence, they're absolutely training the Free Syrian Army and these other bands that go in there and usually get jacked by the jihadists. But they're training them in Turkey and providing a safe haven. So Turkey, anything coming out of Turkey related to the chemical weapons attack, I'm very skeptical of, because they've taken a side in this war.
They're not just training with them. Remember Operation Euphrates Shield? They're actually on the ground fighting together with some FSA guys, capturing Syrian territory. They have captured quite a bit of the border territory there. That's Turkish military in there too.
Absolutely. And, let's say I'm willing to grant everything the Turkish health ministry is saying concerning these autopsies. I really have no reason to doubt that some kind of nerve agent exploded or was in the air and affected people. But just assuming that the findings are true, it's still far from, there are questions of how was the substance delivered, in what form, or munition, or was it a mortar shell? Was it by air? Was it a local explosion? Was it some kind of chemical dump or warehouse that was hit, and so on? If you read the past literature, PCW and UN collection team, as they've worked in Syria, or frankly even other places like the UN mission in Iraq, and you really get to know the difficulties faced in terms of gathering the science and establishing sort of the chain of collection, as well as even how substances were delivered in the midst of battle. It is an incredibly difficult process, incredibly difficult. And that's why you often see in this UN or OPCW documentation, even their language is often very, very guarded, very careful, extremely cautious. Well, because this is science, and that is the language of science. When there's any variable, science is very cautious to state all the possible variables. And the fact is, we're dealing with the most horrible grinding war in modern history, and the fog of war is absolutely thick. And I can tell you, when I was over there this last time in November of 2016, there might be stuff happening like around the corner. I mean, literally, I was a 5-minute walk from Jobar, and on the ground, even you didn't have a clear picture of everything going on around you. If there was some shootout or bomb that went off a block away, and I wasn't literally standing there to see it all, it would still be, a kind of fog of war situation where I would have to be very careful in collecting the data, witness accounts, and so on. So sadly, sometimes even when you're on the ground, it's a very confusing and fluid situation. And so, yes, bottom line is that we're all being asked to, believe something based on essentially YouTube videos and a little bit of science that has been done in a country that's a party to one side of the conflict.
I think that the situation with East Aleppo is also worth bringing up just briefly, because all the reporting on East Aleppo before the full evacuation was finished, it all came from opposition activists, some of the same players or similar players from whom we're getting the information now. And after having followed that East Aleppo situation on a daily basis, and I am very jaded by the information that came, the propaganda, frankly, that came from this group of people. So that's where a lot of my doubts come from. Also, the 2013 situation, Obama changed his mind because his head of intelligence said this isn't a slam dunk. And in fact, there was evidence that it could have been the rebels who carried out that attack. But it was enough for Obama to change his mind, but he never told the American people that. He never told the American people really why he didn't do that attack. And I think that particular thing, the fact that we were not given factual information at that point in time, has laid the groundwork for another situation, which it certainly seems some people are determined for it to have a different outcome this time. We're hearing that the generals don't want a full ground invasion with a lot of American troops. But I'm also hearing that McMaster actually does want that. Now, how do we know? We don't know. It's all rumor as to which higher level authorities want what. But I just get the distinct sense that this is a do-over. And there are certain people who wanted the outcome to be different this time. Maybe it was just for a publicity stunt. But after the Iraq War, I don't think we can be so sure that there aren't people who are serious about, like Sean Spicer twice slipped and said that Trump's real goal was to destabilize the region. He didn't slip and say that only once. He did it twice, 2 days in a row. That was during the same incident when he said that, he was all discombobulated because he had just said that Hitler never did any chemical weapon attacks.
But Joanne, also, how many of the general public, because we're talking about what the public's getting inundated with, know that the rebels have also been confirmed to have used chemical weapons? I think part of this, the way this is playing out is because Assad is the government, right? People are kind of saying, oh, they're the government. They have all the power. They have a monopoly on chemical weapons. When there's been confirmed use by ISIS and other rebel groups, I think that has not gotten into the mainstream reporting. I think people do not know that, for all you know, if you want a plausible scenario, okay, let's say ISIS or Al-Qaeda buried chemical weapons in a spot near this place and the Assad Air Force hit it. There's your chemical weapon attack, right? I mean, I'm not saying that's what happened. I'm just saying that there's so many plausible scenarios because many parties to the conflict have used these terrible weapons, quote unquote. So I think that's completely lost. And there's definitely confirmed UN reports that ISIS used chemical weapons. So I just wonder maybe if for people who are trying to draw out more of a nuanced view, if that's something worth talking about. That, hey, do you know that Assad isn't the only people even accused by international third parties of using chemical weapons? Do you know ISIS has been caught using chemical weapons? Maybe that's an idea. I don't know.
I don't think people have gotten that perspective.
Yeah, I'm sorry. It's also the case that according to analyst Aaron Lund, who is a very well-respected, he's at the Carnegie, one of the Carnegie-funded think tanks. He did a report that shows between 2014 and 2016, the opposition has claimed to have been attacked with some form of chemical weapons, I believe it was 130 times. And so what people also don't realize is that the opposition is actually very consistently claiming and is actually fairly consistently uploading, videos claiming proof and things like that. So I'm not saying that every case is false, but that's another important piece of contextual information, because the fact is you do have a kind of where, yes, this does appear to be a bigger event or even mass event, but the fact is it's interesting to notice what the world media highlights, what is often very selectively highlighted. And the fact is, we all know, what did this event take place? We're talking before a new round of major peace talks. Right. It also took place, as Assad just said in his recent interview with, I think, a French channel. It's not the case that the Syrian army was simultaneously fighting for its life in northern Hama. The Syrian army had just pushed back a major rebel al-Qaeda insurgency in northern Hama and was victorious. And then this event follows. The claim is that this was some kind of revenge for that event. But Assad, in a recent interview, actually sounded, he said, now, why would we unleash chemical weapons on some dusty town in southern Idlib that lacks any strategic importance when, frankly, we would have used it as the Syrian army was fighting for its life in both northern Hama and in the suburbs of Damascus? That's another very just obvious, contextual bit of information that we can't rely on the media to cover. And frankly, we've been talking about the UN and international agreement to decommission Syria's sarin. In 2014, Secretary of State John Kerry was bragging about this great victory that, you saw embassies putting out statements, U.S. embassies putting out statements bragging on 100% of Syria's declared chemical sarin weapons have been decommissioned. This was like a great thing. And suddenly there's been this strange reversal in the media. Well, okay, maybe that wasn't true. And so the people,
it was a great thing too,
Absolutely. This was an example of, when diplomacy actually happens, as Congressman Ron Paul always says, what does the State Department have, like 30,000 personnel? Let's actually use a few. This is what can happen. We can go around. Why don't we go around negotiating for the end of all WMDs and these horrible weapons? So this was touted as a great victory, and it actually was, absolutely. But suddenly, reversing course again. Oh, Assad must have hid half of them or something. We go back to Jerry Lewis, head of UN mission, who says, no, we did get rid of them. We got rid of all the declared stockpiles, and Russia was involved in this. The United States was involved in this. It wasn't some scam or conspiracy, but even that's now being woven into some kind of nefarious conspiracy to make it look like all the sarin away. And people need to realize this is unprecedented in modern history. It really was unprecedented in modern history. You did have Gaddafi giving up his ambitions for a WMD program, but it was nowhere near as entrenched as Syria's chemical program. Precedented. And so for Assad to just turn around and say, well, now I'm going to just pull out some hidden sarin and use it on this dusty little town on the Damascus highway in southern Idlib, it just makes absolutely no sense.
And completely sabotage myself. One thing the guy has not shown to be, I have no affection for the man, but he has not shown himself to be suicidal. Quite the opposite, I think. And, Brett, I did wonder this one thing about the 2014 removal of all the chemical weapons. Some territory was under control of ISIS at the time, some under control of other opposition. And presumably there were stockpiles in those areas too. Did those get left behind, or were there Syrian military assets under the control of the opposition or ISIS at the time where chemical weapons stores were? Do we know that?
Yeah, my understanding is that there were two under what you could call either opposition or rebel or even ISIS held territory. That's my limited understanding.
Right. So that's also a big factor, really.
Yeah, two locations outside of the mandate.
Brad, we've kind of kept you for over.
We've kept you a while here.
No problem. It's important stuff we need to talk about. And if I could just wrap this up with saying this, I have no, particular advanced expertise in Syria or any of this. Frankly, my story is that I came to know or get into understanding or studying Syria just by going there when I got out of the Marine Corps. And since then, I've been back something like 8 times. I used to have an apartment in the old city in Damascus. And I tend to tell Americans, you really have to see it to believe it. But the fact is, especially talking about this current buildup to potential war, most Syrians you encounter, especially in government-held areas, are not only secular, they are apolitical. There's a lot of just average people that I spoke to in this last trip in November that they actually very much dislike the regime, and they very much hate the rebels. And they just want this whole thing to end at any possible way. There's a lot of just apolitical people that are actually not invested in either side. And sadly, the media never highlights those voices. But, if you go to Syria, it's just very normal, down-to-earth people that are very sick of this. And, sadly, they've become victims in this sort of international proxy war. And now we're kind of unleashing bigger and bigger weapons. And yeah, you're exactly right. People should not dismiss the potential for World War III. In fact, they should be out in the streets right now, and we should be writing our congressmen, calling, doing absolutely anything it takes to prevent what would ultimately be the continued demise of our empire as well. I mean, as concerned as I am also for just Syrians, and I have a lot of friends and people I love in Syria who are caught in this horrible war for the past 6 years. I also am concerned for our own people, and especially our troops, especially our young active duty personnel. I have young people I teach who are just about to be sent off to various branches of the armed services, and I'm very scared for the future.
On that note.
On that happy note. Thanks so much, Brad. It was great talking with you. And take care.
Thank you. Thanks so much for having me. Thank you.
Have a good one. Bye-bye.
Bye now.
And that's our show. I want to thank you for listening, and a special thank you to Brad Hoff. Follow Brad Hoff on Twitter at Brad Hoff, BradRhoff, and find his writing at thecanary.co, SOFREP, SOFREP.com, and Libertarianinstitute.org. If you'd like to support the show, and we'd really appreciate it, please visit us at patreon.com/aroundtheempire for as little as $5 a month. We can put on this show. Thanks again. Questions, comments, want to yell at me? Dan at shatterproof.com. If you'd like to read more of mine and Joanne's work, shatterproof.com. See you next time.
Take care.